welcome, and I'm very thankful you're here. I'm Tom Gillesberg, chairman of the Schiller Institute here in Denmark, also leader of the Copenhagen office of the Executive Intelligence Review. And as probably you know, we have been regularly having these seminars, both for diplomats, also trying to get other institutions in play in Denmark to discuss the real issue of the times. Not the fake news we see in the media, but those real issues which right now is deciding whether we will have war or peace, whether civilization will prosper or totally be wiped off the planet, off the earth, which still, unfortunately, I think, is an option if you look at the world situation. And we are standing right now in front of the G20 meeting starting tomorrow in Buenos Aires in Argentina, where there will be hectic diplomatic activity. There's pre-announced meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Xi Jinping, Trump, Modi, Trump, Abe, all the others are going to meet at crisscross. And we have explicitly called for Donald Trump to take this as an opportunity now when he was past the midterm election and was able to defeat the onslaught in the sense that the Democrats were not able to take leadership of both the House and the Senate and thereby beginning running impeachment proceedings or something else to get Trump out. Now that is over. Now he has to rise to the occasion and use this opportunity to sit down with these other leaders, most explicitly sitting down with China and with Russia and begin to dealing with some of the issues of the world, which for the last 2 years when he has been president, he has said he had had the intention to deal with, but has not really been able to deal with. And we have also seen in the recent days, of course, in front of this opportunity, a new strategic crisis developing in the Black Sea and so, and it's very predictable that the British circles that has been running the coup attempts against Trump has not given up. They still would like the world to go back to the old paradigm of basically war and confrontation we have been on for so long. So all of these matters will be addressed by Helga Sepp-LaRouche, which we had to change the schedule, so she won't be speaking first. She'll come on via live video link at 10:30. And meanwhile, we therefore have changed the order of events, that we therefore instead first will go into a very second important announcement that we have made, which is the fact that we have recently released the second volume of this report, The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, a Shared Future for Humanity. And this, of course, is the solution to many of these things. This is the blueprint for what to do. And before Hussein dives into it, I just want to say that what we are going to hear today is also something we try to go out with very actively into the political processes. So a week ago, last Thursday, we were actually a delegation from the Schiller Institute into the Danish Parliament in front of the Business Committee, which are the committee which deals with anything relating to business. It's also the committee dealing with questions of what are the laws that should regulate the banks. And in light of the recent very dramatic banking scandals we've had here in Denmark, we actually experienced for the first time, I would say, in quite some time, that there was a genuine interest to hear what do we say, what are actually the solutions. And what you will hear today is more comprehensive, the discussion which we actually also brought into the Danish Parliament and said that these are the times where decisive action has to be taken. That we have seen that at the same time as we in the last 10 years has experienced the fallout of a collapsing Western paradigm in terms of the financial crisis of 2007-2008 never really being solved. And now we're coming to phase 2 of that. At the same time as that has been the case, we have had a very effective, a very fantastic, a very progressive and a very inclusive new paradigm developing on this planet, of course, with the Chinese Silk Road in the driver's seat. And where the obvious thing to do is for the rest of the world not to bow down and say now China should be the new world leader, everybody should obey, like we should obey the United States of yesterday, but say no, now are the new times beyond geopolitics, beyond spheres of interest, beyond all of that, where you actually can have genuine collaboration among all of the world's nations for all of mankind. And that is a very distinct opportunity. So we will begin with a very honored to have here Hussein Askary. He has come down from Stockholm, where he sometimes resides, but otherwise is traveling around the world because he's been extremely active. He's the as you can see, the Southwest Asia coordinator of the Schiller Institute, also been very active in parts of Africa, in Northern Africa especially. He has also been I just want to say, the translator of the first volume we had of this report, which is extremely important to get it out in the world, not just in English, but also in the other major languages. So I would really like Hussein to tell us something with the insight he has, being one of the authors also of both the report we recently made specifically on Southwest Asia and Africa, but also the latest report, to give a taste of what this new report does. Of course, also so you will be inspired to actually buy it and read it and spread it around the world. So Hussein.
Thank you, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be in Copenhagen, like always, in spite of the weather. I am, as Tom said, the Southwest Asia coordinator with the Schiller Institute. I've been working on these different publications, but what we have actually been doing in the past, with my engagement with the Schiller Institute, 24 years, is to promote the idea of a new world economic order based on building a new international economic system, a just system for cooperation among nations, but mostly based on the question of development of nations and connection, building infrastructure projects, modern infrastructure, modern economies, industrialization in each nation, but among nations and even continents. So this is something which has been developing for 3 decades or more within the Schiller Institute and the international LaRouche movement. One thing I have to actually say is that the world has changed. And the world has changed dramatically in the past few years. And there's what we call the spirit of the new Silk Road is spreading all over the planet. And it's a process which is not stoppable. It's not simply China trying to build the Silk Road. There's a whole new paradigm taking place, taking hold on this planet and bringing more and more nations into that new paradigm, which is the subject of our discussion. I think Mrs. Helga Sepp-LaRouche will be the perfect person to address that question, because there are 2 main reasons why that change is happening. The first reason, and without exaggeration, is the fantastic work with the Schiller Institute and Mrs. Helga Sepp-LaRouche and her husband, Mr. LaRouche, has been doing for the past 40 years, spreading the ideas, developing new ideas, and making sure that governments all over the world, communities, understand these ideas and implement them. It's the reason we call it the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge is that it's not simply the Silk Road, which people think about, these camel caravans going from China to Europe, passing by the desert in the Islamic world. This is not our concept of the Silk Road. And it was not even, the old Silk Road was not only a trade route. It was not a caravan route. It was a dialogue of civilizations. It contributed to communication, bringing technologies and culture all over the globe, which has massive implications for how humanity has developed. So this new Silk Road is not a trade question. It's a question of developing a total new community among nations. But also in LaRouche's thinking is that this is going to be not simply a Eurasian issue, this will be a global issue. That's what we call it, the world land bridge. Now this is it's volume number 2 because it follows on the footsteps of the first volume, which was produced in 2014. There were 2 main events which prompted Mrs. Helga Sepp-LaRouche to commission the first volume, which was, first of all, the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative by President Xi Jinping in September and October 2013. And then we had the Fortaleza Summit of the BRICS countries. These are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the Fortaleza Declaration, which meant a completely new order is being developed in the world with these major, the fastest growing nations and also the largest nations on the planet, getting together to establish a new economic order, which is generally not so different than the one which our movement has been calling for. And it was translated into Chinese first in China, in the Renmin University. I did the Arabic translation, and now we have also a German translation. Volume number 2 is translated into French. It was presented recently. So I had the honor to translate that and also present it. It was launched in Egypt. I was invited by the Transport Ministry of Egypt to have the launching of the Arabic version of our first report in Egypt, in the Egyptian Transport Ministry. This is the Transport Minister at the time, Dr. Saad al-Ghiyoushi, and there was a massive press conference. I was also received by the head of the Suez Canal Authority, who expressed support to the, and also Egypt is now completely integrated into the Belt and Road, New Silk Road strategy. Egypt has a massive industrialization process, infrastructure building. So this was part of the promoting the work. But the history of the development of this concept of the New Silk Road goes very long back in time. It did not start in 2013 with President Xi Jinping's announcement, although that was the major breaking point for the idea globally, turning an idea into a global phenomena which will change even the physical state of our planet. The Schiller Institute, the LaRouche movement, already in 1992 presented the idea of after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, is to have a new Marshall Plan for the world to develop Eastern Europe and building bridges between Europe and Asia. So that idea was already almost developed at the time. The irony is that it was supposed to be Europe which would lead the way to accomplishing this project. But that did not happen for reasons which I will also discuss, because Europe and the United States went into the opposite direction of deindustrialization, into a complete rotten financial speculation system, and completely forgot about the idea of developing nations, developing industries, and improving living conditions of people. So, but this thing took hold very early, and the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement have had hundreds of seminars like this, international conferences, publications, to promote the idea. A big breakthrough was in 1996 when the Chinese government adopted the idea of establishing the New Silk Road as a strategy for China. At the time, as you all know now, that China was on the way to a massive industrialization process in China itself. So the idea has not reached outside the boundaries of China itself, but it was pronounced as a policy of the Chinese government. And at the time, Mrs. Helga Sepp-LaRouche was invited to that conference in '96, and then immediately after that, we published the first report. It's called the Eurasian Land Bridge, the New Silk Road Locomotive for Worldwide Economic Development. And since then, it has become now, even in China, Mrs. Helga Sepp-LaRouche is very often in China. Other members, I was myself in China last month speaking in a conference on the Belt and Road. But Mrs. Helga Sepp-LaRouche is known in China as the Silk Road Lady, because all the Chinese who work with this idea and this concept, who have followed this, know that it was the Schiller Institute and her personally who have been promoting this. And she participated last year in the first Belt and Road Forum, which was hosted by President Xi Jinping. So there's a very clear connection to our work and to the development of that concept. Now, the other reason why this paradigm is taking place is that both personal leadership by President Xi Jinping and China itself, its commitment to make the new Silk Road a global phenomenon. Now, China has achieved a fantastic, and everybody admits that now, an unprecedented development process. Never happened in history, lifting 700 million people out of poverty within 3 decades, and the remaining 120 soon. And China is planning to become the world's leading industrial nation by 2025. But China is also bringing its own experience, its own resources to make this thing a global issue. All developing nations, according to the Chinese, can develop exactly as China did, because we do have the technology, we do have the resources, and there's no reason why there should be poor countries, underdeveloped countries. And the personal commitment by President Xi Jinping, after announcing the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, has made, you can see this when you go to China. All China, all the people, the institutions, the industries, everybody is focused on the Belt and Road policy. All the energy, all the resources are directed in one direction. It's a little bit different than here, with people running in many different directions. But you can imagine that the second economy in the world moving all in one force, 1.3 billion people with all their resources moving in one direction. That's enormous power. And that power is not to project military or power against other nations, but to use that to make it beneficial for the rest of the world. Just to give you a general idea, the connection between the Belt and Road and our idea of the World Land Bridge, because the Belt and Road consists formally of 6 major corridors extending from China into Eurasia, into Southeast Asia, into West Asia. These are, it's not necessary, but these are the ones in green. And then you have the maritime Silk Road, which is a seagoing Silk Road, the Chinese call it. And it's a sea-based, but it includes also building the ports and new sea lanes and logistics center and so on and so forth to make communication, connectivity, logistics much, much easier. Do you have a question? No. Okay. So I don't really need to go through this because you have all the information there, but it just gives you a vision. But the rest of these, which are not in green and blue, these are the Schiller Institute's idea how we can connect all continents together. Now the Chinese Belt and Road actually has extended now to South America. They are offering to work with Europe and the United States, but they are still resisting to work with China because they have issues with China which are not based on reality. I mean, we can discuss this, but this is not really the theme of my presentation. But all in all, this is a very, very positive development, and all nations should join into it. Now, as I said, this new paradigm, more and more nations are getting into it, joining this new force in the world. And it's quite ironical because in September, we had 2 major events. We had the China-Africa Forum for Economic Cooperation in Beijing on the 3rd and 4th of September. And almost all heads of state of African nations, like 52 heads of state, attended that conference. Now, 2 weeks later, only half of Africa's heads of state attended the United Nations General Assembly meeting, which shows you where the emphasis is. Because as many African leaders have expressed it, when they go to the United Nations or Europe, they get only lectures on democracy, human rights, women's rights, this and that, but there is never any actual economic cooperation, no infrastructure being built. And that's why they are orienting towards China and also other groupings, Russia, India, instead of relying on this almost obsolete relationship which Africa has had with Europe and the United States, which has produced nothing. Worse than that, it has produced many problems, famine, epidemics, civil wars, and so on and so forth. So this just gives you a sense of that the new paradigm is an unstoppable force, and it's a positive force, and all nations should join into it. So going back to what I said earlier is that there's this irony which the Schiller Institute, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, said, now we have the largest concentration of industrial and scientific capability located in the triangle between Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and then that this force, this industrial and technological capability should be used to develop Eastern Europe, Russia, and move forward into other regions as a new system of relations among nations based on economic development. But of course, that did not happen. If you study, and this is one of the main themes actually in our report, it's not simply all the nice railways projects being built or the dams, and which are very, very important, which we report there. But there's one very important aspect of our work, which is today is almost not known in universities and in so-called economic studies when people discuss the Belt, even the Belt and Road. Because the people who criticize and attack the Belt and Road usually are security guys, intelligence people. They are not economists. And the problem is that even economists are not educated in what we call physical economy, which is a completely different branch of what is being taught in schools. And the most important living physical economist on the planet today is Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. He's the husband of Mrs. Helga Sepp LaRouche. And he has, for decades, advocated this idea of a new economic system. And he has been politically active. As you see there's in the 1980 presidential election campaigns, Mr. LaRouche ran for president. This was during a debate between the presidential candidates, and this is President Ronald Reagan, and that in itself produced a very interesting kind of communication with the Reagan administration, which is no secret today, which gave birth to the idea of this strategic defense initiative, which I will also discuss a little bit. Mr. Lyndon LaRouche also has made forecasts based on his knowledge of physical economics. And this is very, very important today because to understand why Europe and the United States failed to respond to the Schiller Institute's call for this new world economic order, or the failure generally today of the economies in Europe and the United States, because we have deep, deep crisis. We have a rotting infrastructure. We have unemployment, drug addiction, suicide rates. All these things are an accumulation of 40 years of economic, financial, and even cultural descent. If you look at the economy as Mr. LaRouche does, then you are able to predict, because if you look, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche's idea is that the only true value in economics is increasing the productive capabilities of labor and of society, using scientific breakthroughs and technological breakthroughs to raise the productivity and the living standards of population. So if you want to understand where an economy is heading, where a nation is heading, you have to look at very specific parameters. You don't look at the stock markets. As Mr. LaRouche says, the news, they say, oh, the stock markets are going up. And he says, oh yeah, so you mean the cancer is growing. Why don't you tell me how is the patient doing? Because the financial and monetary resources, if they grow without any relationship to the physical economy, they become like a cancer. And this made Mr. LaRouche capable of forecasting, not simply predicting, the collapse of the financial system in the West. where he presented this called the typical collapse function, or the triple curve. He presented this in 1995 already in an international conference, where he says, if you look at the production of monetary value, money, and financial value, you see an enormous growth. But when it comes to physical economic parameters, that's investment in infrastructure, industry, agriculture, healthcare, education, we have had a different development in the Western world. And this will inevitably lead to a collapse of both the financial system and the economy. And if you look at these parameters, then you have a completely different picture where a nation or an economy is going. And this also gives you a comparative picture of what has happened in the United States. We take the United States as an example, where, as I said, the financial and economic aggregates. But if you want to understand where your government or your economy is heading, you have to look at, for example, how much of your GDP is invested in building infrastructure, developing infrastructure. In the United States, since the 50s, it went from 3% and up into, and down in Obama's time, the investments in infrastructure went to below 1.4% of GDP. In China, 9% of GDP is invested in infrastructure. So that gives you an idea where China is heading and where the United States is heading. So every time there is a hurricane in the United States now, you see terrible consequences. Every time there is a blizzard, a snowstorm, you have terrible consequences. Not because blizzards and hurricanes are a new phenomenon in the United States, but because the United States infrastructure has been rotting, collapsing, cannot cope with. And I think our friends 2 weeks ago, they had a terrible time in New York and New Jersey, where you had like 6-8 hour delays because there was a few inches of snow falling on the road. So this is the kind of parameters you have to look at when you judge an economy, whether it's your nation or a group of nations. And recently, in 2017, the United States Civil Engineers Society gave the US infrastructure the status of D+, which is not good. If you go to your parents with D+, you go from school to your parents and say, oh, I got D+ in school, they will be very angry. What happened to the A, the A+? You know, it's like, and this is the state of the United States infrastructure. It's a terrible, terrible situation. We all heard about the fires in California. Yes, that's terrible, but all the groundwork, you know, if you have forest, there's a lot of work you need to do in the forest to make it grow better and also to prevent fires. All that work was neglected in the previous administrations. Why? Because it cost money. You know, I should have people going into the forest, removing shrubs and dried plants and so on. Yeah, well, that, you know, that's what happens when you don't care about your infrastructure. So anyway, my point is that we are not like having fun at the United States, but we say this is a terrible condition for a nation to fall into. And I'm sure if we do similar studies in Europe, we will have similar results. I mean, we all saw what happened to the bridge in Genoa recently, which completely collapsed. So anyway, if we go to the global picture, I mean, that people don't misunderstand me that the world has suddenly become a better place. It's not. What I'm saying is that we have a new paradigm. It's taking hold in the world to solve the terrible many problems which should have been solved already 30, 40 years ago. But because of the failure of the leadership of the world system, which is the United States and Europe, these problems persist today. I was in Beijing, as I said, last month, and I spoke in a conference on the impact of the Belt and Road on food security in the world. And I presented this picture, which doesn't look very good. This is the world hunger map, and we can see that in the yellow spots, there are some improvements, but we still have terrible, terrible conditions where we have 800 million people who cannot meet their daily needs of the basic needs of food. And if we take a look at the next slide, we can figure out that approximately where these nations lie. We have, this is an exaggerated picture of the world deserts. And you can see this is a global phenomena. You know, these are arid areas, not all desert, but they are dry areas too. And they stretch from Africa into Eurasia. And the problem here is not that this is something which is, it's a big global problem, but it doesn't mean it cannot be solved. Because many of the countries who have these food shortages, they either don't have water, which is called physical scarcity, which it doesn't rain. And then you have nations who have a lot of water. If we go back, most of these countries, they have a lot of water. But they have something which is called economic scarcity, it rains a lot, but you don't know how to do with the water. You can't even drink that water because it's poisonous, because you can't clean it. You need economic infrastructure to solve it. And even for the dry regions where it doesn't rain, you can have also infrastructure to solve that problem. And all these things are provided now with this idea, the Belt and Road is promising to provide nations with the basic infrastructure needed to have a better economic situation, could grow food and sustain that growth, have transport systems to move that food produced, have power, because without power you cannot even produce food. If you go to a farm in Denmark, without electricity you cannot produce anything. You know, people think, you know, you are a farmer, you just go into the field, you know, and you grow things. It doesn't happen. You have lots of machines, technologies, which require a lot of power to grow that food. So anyway, Mr. LaRouche and our concept of, when you look at these corridors, which I described, the continental, transcontinental corridors, these are, as I said, not a railway which takes computers and shoes and stuff from China to Europe. These are development corridors, and the development corridor is like a 150 kilometer wide zone passing through areas with, you know, natural resources and even population, but lacks the infrastructure necessary to utilize these resources. And it's composed of transport, railways, highways, water transfer systems, canals or pipelines, electricity and power networks, and then you can build industrial and agricultural zones around these when you have the infrastructure necessary to do that. Then you can use your natural resources, like in many parts of Africa, you have lots of natural resources, but you can't use them because you don't have the infrastructure and the industrial know-how. And this is what we mean by infrastructure generally, both on the ground and in space. But also we have to add, very important, education and healthcare. That's also infrastructure, but it's soft infrastructure. It's not hard infrastructure. Because without education, scientific research, and healthcare, you can't really accomplish the rest of the work. Now, I will focus on what we have in the report is also part of what our previous report, which is the area where I work. You know, I'm not going to talk about South America or Europe because these are not really the regions my work is focused on, so I hope you forgive me for that, but I think it's a good example to take from Africa and Southwest Asia. This is, as Tom said, this is the report we produced in 2017, myself and Jason Ross, a colleague, and with the help of other members of the Schiller Institute, to show not only what the cooperation between China and Africa has done, but where it can go, which direction it should take. And in this concern, we take a big shot at the way Europe and the United States have been treating Africa. Because Africa is like, if you watch the news here, is Africa usually associated with poverty, you know, human rights abuse, civil wars, epidemics, and so on and so forth. So what we can do? Well, we cannot do anything. We can just help as much as we can. And then you get these very, very expensive projects, EU projects, UN projects, but the effect on the ground in Africa is almost nothing. You know, it's like I like this picture. It's a terrible picture, it's a tragic picture, because this is from the website Safe Water Africa, where they ask people in Europe to donate money so they can build these pumps in some villages in Africa. But what people forget is that what this does, it makes poverty permanent. Because what will happen is that these ladies will still have to go from their hut hundreds of meters or kilometers to go and fetch the water and carry these very heavy things every day. And they will send their daughters, of course, and they don't go to school. So you, by this so-called EU-funded project, you make people permanently poor. If you really want to do something good, you should bring the water to the houses of these ladies by building a true infrastructure with pipes and everything. And these ladies should have modern housing, you know, and their daughters and kids will go to school. This is what we call development. This is a show. This makes the Europeans feel good, or Americans, and say, oh, we are doing something for Africa. And when things go to hell, say, oh, well, the Africans are corrupt. They have dictators, they have these guerrilla groups, and so on and so forth. But nobody discusses where those dictators save their money. It's in British, Swiss, and American banks. Where the weapons come from, where the diamond and gold and all these things the guerrilla groups use, where do they go to? So anyway, the question is not to now blame, but we have had a failed policy for many, many years, which are now being replaced by the Chinese model. The Chinese have proven that their model works in China. Now they are proving that their model is working in Africa. And as I said, all African nations want to work with China today because they can't get the kind of development the Chinese themselves have achieved for themselves. Now, there are lots of questions about why China is doing that. I can discuss that. I'm not going to go through it now. But there is no truth to the accusations that China is a new colonial power. It's setting traps for nations to borrow money. All that is nonsense. I have written about it. I can prove it. We can discuss it. But China has become the number one trade partner with Africa. It's the number one investor in infrastructure. It's the number one aid donor to Africa. It's the number one in scientific research with Africa. It's like breaking all the world records. It's like number one in many things in Africa. Africans, there was a skepticism in the beginning, but now Africa is gradually realizing that actually this is not so terrible, especially if you take the train from Djibouti to Addis Ababa, or you take the train from Mombasa to Nairobi. And if you work in factories that are developed by the Chinese. So that model is working. And also, there are many dreams, African dreams, connecting all the African nations together. Africa has a very strong unity process, political and even on a human level, for understandable reasons. Africans see themselves as one big nation, but they are separate sovereign nations. So the dream of connecting all of Africa has existed for more than 40 years, building highways and railways. And now, thanks to China's involvement, that's becoming possible. As I said, the Chinese, all these things, we have technologies, available technologies. It's nothing new. Building railways is not like rocket science, so to speak. You can develop new types of railways, but that technology has existed for 100 years, but it was never used. And Africa never got the tools to build them. Now China is using its own expertise in developing railways, but even high-speed rail in China, and trying to transfer that process into Africa. And in very, very short time, 3 years, we had many projects already starting, and they are accomplished, like the Djibouti-Addis Ababa Railway, the Mombasa-Nairobi. There are many other projects. This is the East African Master Plan which also has been drawn for like 30 years but never implemented. Now it's being implemented. This is the inauguration of the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway. This is Uhuru Kenyatta, the president of Kenya. Very happy to have that accomplished. And it's like these kind of things also, they bring optimism to people. It's like the space program brought optimism to people in America and Europe, because we humans can achieve things. We can build things. We can improve our lives. And that optimism is very, very important when a nation has a mission to go forward. Another project is the, I said Djibouti, Ethiopia. And these, I mean, there are many, many films on YouTube. You can just watch them. Instead of having a European reporter going to Africa and telling you what they think about what China is doing, you should listen to what the Africans say about these projects, or the Chinese say about their cooperation with the Africans. So it's like you've got to go to the original source. One of the very, very important projects which the Schiller Institute has been involved in promoting that should be implemented is what we call the Transaqua. The Lake Chad has been drying for the last 30 years. It's like the one in the center. It's only 10% of its original size now. And there are like 40 million people totally dependent on the water of Lake Chad. They are starting, or have started already, to immigrate from their local areas to other parts of Chad or to Cameroon or Nigeria, creating a big crisis. Many young people are also immigrating to Europe, trying to find a better life. So there was a project which was promoted by an Italian, studied by an Italian company called Bonifica, and the engineer who did it is Marcello Vichi, a friend of the Schiller Institute. He has been speaking in our conferences for many years. We tried to bring this to the European Commission, to European governments, to the United States. No, they said the idea is to build a canal which will collect water from the eastern bank of the tributaries of the Congo River and transfer 5% of the water of the Congo into this canal, which will go by gravitation. You don't need to pump. It's a slope into the Kari River, and then also it's a slope down. And in combination with that, you create transport networks in one of the most isolated regions in Africa. You bring power, because you can generate hydropower. You can build agricultural and industrial centers and transport centers. So it's not simply bringing water to the Lake Chad, but it's transforming the economy. And it will be combined with the building a highway from Mombasa through the Great Lakes region into Nigeria. So it fits perfectly into the general picture of development. And it has been on ice until, with the help of the Schiller Institute, we brought together Chinese and the Italians and the Lake Chad Commission, which is composed of 6 nations on the Lake Chad. And finally, last year, or earlier this year, the Lake Chad Commission accepted the Transaqua project as a policy for the Lake Chad nations, but of course they are unable to build such a huge project themselves. So also thanks to the Schiller Institute, a leading Chinese hydropower and water management system company, and Bonifica, the Italian company, they got together, signed a memorandum of understanding. And last month, the Italian government decided to give $1.5 million euros for the feasibility study of part of this project. So this is a fantastic development. As I said, this also relates to China's own development of water transfer systems. This is the south-north water transfer. Northern China is a dry region, but in the southern part we have big rivers. So the Chinese are building very, very long canals to transfer about 10 billion cubic meters every year of water. Here we will have 100 billion cubic meters, 10 times larger than the Chinese project, but that's feasible. It's doable. It will take a lot of resources and a lot of work to accomplish it, but it's doable. So this is one project which is already going online. The next project was the Grand Inga Dam. It's on the Congo River in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This project has been also on the drawing boards. Everybody have been talking about it for tens of years because the flow of the Congo River is so powerful. You can, with this project, for example, you can generate 40,000 megawatts of electricity. You know, like about 40 in Sweden. You don't have nuclear power plants here, but in Sweden we have 1,000 megawatt power plants. So this will be compared to 40 nuclear power plants you can generate by building these series of dams only on this location. Last month, the Chinese Sino-Hydro company and a Spanish company, they got together to start working on the first phase of this project. So it's a fantastic move because, like as I said, Italy and China now working on the Transaqua project, Spain and China, and there are many countries in Europe now are moving away from the EU policy of not working with China. They say, no, we need to work with China. We have our own problems, but we also can have great cooperation in Africa. So Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal are all moving into that direction. So this project will go on because the Chinese and Spanish companies were bidding against each other. And the discussions 2 years, 3 years were going on. The World Bank, when they realized that this project can be built, they withdrew their support to the project suddenly. Because the World Bank's idea was never to build this project. They would just make studies to prove that this project cannot be built. But it's great that the World Bank is moving out. I have my own personal views also on the United Nations and the United Nations different organizations. I don't trust the United Nations. I don't trust the United Nations different organizations, the population program, the development program, the climate program. I don't really trust these institutions. I think sovereign nations should decide what policy they should follow. We can discuss that there, but I think the World Bank, IMF, and the United Nations role in Africa has been destructive. And they should not be trusted to assess which projects should be built and which projects should not be built. The sovereign nations can decide themselves in cooperation with other nations who have done similar projects, and they see they are feasible and beneficial. And on that basis, scientific basis, and economic basis, they should make decisions, not a United Nations expert thing. So these kind of projects which can transform Africa from what it is today. This is a true satellite image by night taken by NASA. You can see it's completely dark, almost completely dark. There are some small spots. And this is an image which I asked a friend of mine, an artist, to draw based on the economic program which we have for Africa, which is in the other report. I have to readjust this. This is too far in the future. Given the speed with which China and the new partners of China, this could be adjusted to 2035. Yeah. But all these things are relative. It depends on the will and the interest and the energy put into these projects to transform Africa or any other part of the world. The other region which is my concern is Southwest Asia. Are we still on time?
If you want discussion, then you should.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, is Southwest Asia. I call it Southwest Asia, not the Middle East. And I explained that in the report. The Middle East there is no place on earth called the Middle East, okay? It doesn't exist. It's called West Asia or Southwest Asia. The Middle East is a British colonial creation. The East India Company, which owned large parts of the world, they needed to define these areas from the perspective of London. If you look at the world from London, you see the Near East, the Middle East, and the Far East. Because it's completely absurd for a person in India to call a place which is in the West, Middle East. Yeah? So this is a colonial idea which everybody is copying without thinking about it. There is no such a thing as Middle East. We look at the continents from space. And then we define each continent. It has a geographical structure. It has east, west, north, and south. It's called East Asia, Southeast Asia, North Asia, South Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe. No Middle East and this kind of stuff. So anyway, but this region has been plagued by geopolitics, wars, and in spite of the fact this is one of the richest regions in the world in terms of natural resources, population, but also the geographical, perfect geographical, which Mr. LaRouche calls the crossroads of the continent, which can be utilized. And in that context, we have had a lot of work. Just take the example of Yemen, which is now a devastated country. We have the worst humanitarian crisis. You have starvation, epidemics, all kinds of, because of the war of aggression launched by Saudi Arabia. There's no other reason for that. There is no proxy war or civil war going on. There is a war of aggression against the nation, which destroyed its infrastructure, has a blockade, is preventing medicine and food coming into the country. But even in that context, the new Silk Road idea can resolve a lot of these problems. And we have presented a plan for the reconstruction of Yemen, which is now adopted by at least the investment authority in Yemen as the official policy for reconstructing Yemen and connecting Yemen to the Belt and Road policy, which is based on the same physical economic principles, building development corridors for the nation, with the water, power, transport, education, healthcare, and industrial systems. Now there's a discussion in Stockholm where I stay. There's the peace negotiations between the different Yemeni groups, and hopefully this idea will be discussed as a basis for peace among these groups. But it's the same concept as everywhere else on the planet we are discussing. We have in the report a special section also on the Koreas, how economic development and connectivity can help build the peace process. Because without economic development and communication between peoples, peace agreements like the Arab-Israeli peace agreement will be just something on paper. It never became something true. So anyway, these are things you can read in the report. We have, sorry?
You want to maybe also have time, just leave some time for discussion.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, we have, the planet is, we have major threats to our planet. We have, Earth is still a dangerous place. We have threat of wars, as Tom has described, and maybe Mrs. Helga Sablarush will describe. But to solve our problems on Earth, we have to look at them, in my opinion, from two places. We have to look at them from outer space and with the eyes of the future. We have to look at the present from the future, because the idea of what future we want to have will determine what we do now on Earth. Exactly what I said about the Africa in the future. But also, if you look at humanity and Earth from the way space astronauts see it. We have all these astronauts, they work together from different nations in the International Space Station, and you hear their description, and they say, from there, we see only one humanity. We see one planet. We don't see all these divisions. We don't see all these problems that, we live in every day. So if we look at all our problems from the standpoint of those people working together on scientific projects, on cultural projects, and make that the basis of our policies, each nation's policies, then we can get rid of all kinds of problems. I'm not going to continue more than this. We can keep some time for the discussion. But I will encourage everybody, because all these things I mentioned in brief, they are in very, very vast detail in the report. You can also continue having discussions with the Schiller Institute people here and get answers to your questions too. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. And I wanted to leave a little time for discussion. I want to say, as you can see, we are recording things, which is for the benefit of those who cannot be here. We will only be recording the speakers. The audience don't have to be worried that they will be quoted and put up somewhere, except maybe under Chatham House rules that the general gist of a question from somebody can be said, but without naming the source of it. So people can be able to ask real questions and we can have real discussions of this. Because that, I think, is something very much lacking. There's a lot of discussions going on, but part of the whole control process, the way the world is controlled, is that certain circles, especially like the British, is putting themselves in charge of setting up the discussions. So there's a lot of discussions going on, but it's within a very set framework where there will never be any possibility of real solutions. So people can talk until the sun goes black and it won't change anything. Now, especially at a time when there are so rich possibilities, I think that has to be, that opportunity has to be taken. So we have a little bit of time now for questions to Hussein. Then we'll take a short break where people can get some coffee and water. And then at 10:30 we will get Helga Sepp-Lavouche on, which will give also another part of the big picture. So please, yeah, questions, comments, yeah. Yes, please.
South Asia, yeah. And the other question was, what is the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative and the New Silk Road on the European countries? And what is the EU policy vis-a-vis China? Because they consider China as a rival of the West. If we could elaborate on that. Okay, yeah, the only thing I can advise is that because we have a whole section on South Asia, on cooperation, not only the Belt and Road Initiative connection, for example, the China, Myanmar, Bangladesh connection. We have the Mekong River Nations Development Plan, and there is enormous cooperation going on between China and the South Asian countries. Now, India is a little bit on the side. But for example, the China-Pakistan economic corridor is advancing very, very fast. The only reason India is not involved is geopolitical reasons, and also pressure from groups within India, but also from the United States and other forces to prevent India-China cooperation. Because if these two nations get together, then the effect of the whole initiative will be many, many times greater. So on the specific details of the projects, I can't go through the details because I leave it to my colleagues who work on South Asia. But I see a big enthusiasm and work being done. One interesting thing is happening now concerning that region is that Japan, which is considered in the West that as a US ally, they are also rivals of China and Russia. It's not true. Japan has changed its attitude and now is working with China in both Africa but in South Asia. One very, very big project which China and Japan together are interested to build is the Kra Canal project, which is in Thailand. You know, the Kra Isthmus, where you can yes, where you can cut short the shipping, the navigation going through the Malacca Strait, which takes both long time, but also is a very troubled area. So it's going to be a revolutionary. It's like a Panama Canal project, and both China and Japan are willing to work together on that project. So this kind of developments are going on, and many, many nations are realizing that it's in their best interest, like Japan or South Korea, to work with China. They do have projects in South Asia and Africa, but they have been like European-style projects, aid projects, small projects, but now they are going big time with the Chinese model. Concerning Europe, I mean, Europe has Europe has two problems, because as I described, Europe has stopped industrialization. We are going backwards in time. We have a stagnating economies. We have a so-called environmental idea that big infrastructure projects, industrial projects, technology are bad for the human race. And therefore, we should roll back the industrialization process, go to the pre-industrial era. We should shut down, some newspapers, they say the internal combustion engine was one of the worst crimes committed against humanity. It's like without the internal combustion engine, you can't have anything moving on Earth. It's like the engines running the trains and the cars and trucks. So we have both a negative attitude. Europe has a negative attitude to development, but also we are plagued by these other combined with that, we have had more and more emphasis on a financial economy where people can invest their money in financial markets and then use the profit to buy consumer goods produced by other nations. And that system is collapsing because you cannot sustain a casino type of economy. And this is the kind of thing our friends are also involved in, to reform the banking and financial system in Europe, to allow Europe to have resources to participate in infrastructure projects, both in Europe and other parts of the world. The other big problem is geopolitics, because European politicians, but also this, what we call the British Empire ideology, is that human beings and nations are like beasts. Everybody's fighting over limited resources. We have a limited amount of resources on Earth, and it's not enough for everybody. So the smart ones can take over things, and then leave the crumbs for the others. And you have to prevent other big powers from developing, because they will compete with you to take these limited resources. And this is what the Chinese president criticizes. We have criticized that, and we have also written books on that this ideology, what we call Malthusian ideology, or limited resources ideology, is false, both economically, scientifically, and morally. There are no limited resources. The only limitation we put is what this space scientist Kraft Erika says. These are my next two slides, but I didn't have time. Is that it's the limitations we put to ourselves. The most important source of growth is the human mind. It's not the natural resources. We can create new natural resources which we never knew about before. As you look at energy, we went from burning wood to coal to oil and gas to nuclear power. All these things didn't exist for humankind. The human mind discovered them. And we can go to fusion power. We can create new materials which never existed on this planet. So that's not the problem. The problem is this ideology of humans are beasts. We cannot cooperate with each other. We are egoistic. And nations are the same. And that's completely false. And as I said, we can work together perfectly fine. We can get resources to everybody, but we need to work on a scientific and also on a culturally higher level than this British imperialist ideology. So Europe's problem is these combination of these three, is this deindustrialization ideology, the problem with the considering money as the source of wealth, and geopolitics, British geopolitics. These are the three problems which prevent Europe from working with China. Otherwise, China has no bad intentions. Nobody has proven anything that China, they say China intends to do this, intends to do that. How do you know they intend? It's a projection, because they say, well, Europe did that in the world. When we became powerful, we went and occupied Africa and South America, and we looted people, we killed people, we took their resources. China will do the same. This is human nature. No, sorry. This is not human nature. This is a criminal imperialist system nature. It's not our natural state. So they project this European colonial or imperialist idea on China. China has a completely different history. It has a completely different philosophy. And they refuse to study Chinese history and philosophy. And they refuse to understand what President Xi Jinping says when he says, we should not have zero-sum games. We should not have geopolitics. We should have a win-win cooperation. These are not mere nice words. We have proven scientifically that this is the way nations can develop, how humanity can develop. We have experienced this in Europe ourselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Hussein.